Okay.
Well, that's fancy.
Well, thank you so much for joining, everybody. I'm Veronica Howard. I'm one of the board members, one of the executive council for the Association for Behavior Analysis Open Educational Resources Special Interest Group. And we're very pleased to be able to invite Dr. Amy Nusbaum to join us today. So just as a little bit of context for our experience today, like most folks here would endorse that behavior analysis is a pretty powerful science, and we can all agree that shaping and enriching the learning environment can do very powerful things to promote student success. However, behavior analysis is also an incredibly insular field. It's sometimes hard to break out and see what other related fields are doing. And I think in order to truly find exciting new horizons, new work that's being done, we have to break down some of those walls and see what's going on outside of our field. And it's with that spirit that we have invited Dr. Amy Nusbaum to present for us today. Dr. Nusbaum is a graduate of the Washington State University Graduate Program in Experimental Psychology. And even though her particular specialty area is in cognitive psychology, she asks us not to hold that against her. For those of you who are not in the field of psychology or behavior analysis, there is a bit of a long-standing philosophic rivalry between cognitive psych and behavior analysis, which is the foundation of that joke. But back to the introduction. Dr. Nusbaum is an assistant professor at Heritage University, a Hispanic serving and Native American serving non-tribal institution located in Toppenish, Washington. Amy was recently awarded, and I think very rightly so, the Wilbert J. McKeechee Award by the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. The award recognizes one graduate student instructor each year for excellence in teaching. And you can appreciate why she would be awarded this amazing honor and why we're so excited to host Dr. Nusbaum today. In the words of one of her former students, Amy sends a powerful message to her students. Regardless of your educational background, school is for you. Dr. Nusbaum has an extensive background in open educational resources, in the empirical validation of teaching strategies, and for fiercely promoting student success. And she's worked with OER as a teacher, a researcher, a creator, and a powerful advocate. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Nusbaum.
You embellished the introduction that I sent you, I noticed.
I believe that is consistent with my rights under a Creative Commons license. Yeah.
I didn't openly license that. Okay, Veronica, do you want to cover this stuff?
I do, and if you could be so kind, I think there's some animations here. Yeah. Now, if you are earning a continuing education unit today, or if you need documentation for your event, please don't forget to, and just tap, tap, tap like 3 times, sign in with your name and email address in the chat. We are gonna ask you again to sign out at the end of the event, to rate this event within 48 hours of the workshop, and then one more tap, please, Amy. We are going to send out participation and CE certificates to folks within 1 to 2 weeks. Now, free CE events like these are regularly offered for our members. If you're not a member, you can join us at www.openbehaviorsig.org. You can also find us on Facebook. And we have 2 major learning objectives for today. First, and this one's a pretty lengthy one, identify the role of established power structures or systems in content creation and textbook authorship, including the long-term impact on inclusion and equitable access for students from minoritized backgrounds, and to describe strategies to empower students to contribute to the discipline's learning materials. So without any further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Amy Nusbaum.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Howard. So real quick, I am Amy, as was noted. This is Amanda. She is learning how to squeal and scream at the moment, so I promise I am not hurting her if she makes fun noises. So with that, here we go. So was incredibly excited when Veronica asked me to present to y'all, despite the joking rivalry, sometimes joking rivalry between cognitive psychologists and behaviorists. I really believe that the best way to serve our students is to be talking to each other about the kinds of things we're doing. So I'm here today to talk about adding the student voice to OER using Hypothesis. Before we get started, I want to note that the project took place on the traditional lands of the Nez Perce people. That was when I was at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. and I currently work on the sovereign lands of the Yakama Nation. I acknowledge their presence on these lands since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. I do want to note, maybe Veronica, if I'm really bad at monitoring the chat while I'm presenting, so if you want to just interrupt me if someone has a question, thank you. Okay, so a little bit of a just guide to where we're going today. So we're going to start with some background, just sort of what's the situation. We're then going to move into specifically what can Open offer. And then I'm going to talk about two projects actually. So we'll talk about what my students did, what I found when I did some research on what my students did, and then how we can actually use this information to better the learning experience for our students. So first, what's the situation? So student demographics, diversity in college student populations in the US continues to grow. So this is probably unsurprising to those of us in institutions of higher education. Across the US, nearly half of students identify as people of color, which is an increase from about a quarter of students in the mid-1990s. So we're seeing a sharp increase that in some ways reflects the demographics of the country, but we see that in higher education, our rates are rising at higher rates than demographic change, actually. There have also been increases in the percentages of low-income students, so students who are receiving Pell Grants, but also students who maybe don't qualify for Pell Grants, but are otherwise qualified as low income, LGBTQ students, and disabled students. And while these numbers suggest that we've got openness, no pun intended, in educational opportunities, right? We see that these students are getting to our institutions. We see that outcome gaps persist, right? Meaning that students don't have the same educational outcomes even when they're able to get to these institutions. So for instance, Black students have the highest college dropout rates and student loan burdens. We also see that Black students end up with the highest rate or the most student loans when they don't complete their degree. So they end up with student loan burdens and no college degree to show for it. Disabled students complete post-secondary degrees at lower rates than their able peers. And first-generation students, so students whose parents did not complete bachelor's degrees, drop out at rates more than twice that of their peers who have college-educated parents, right? So while these students are getting to our universities at higher levels, they're not necessarily succeeding once they're there. There are a ton of hypothesized reasons for these outcome gaps. One hypothesized cause of these gaps is lower levels of belongingness once they get to campus. So these students make their way to campus, they fight, they claw to get here, and then once they get there, they don't really feel like they belong on campus. They know that they're not necessarily the norm, especially on campuses that are predominantly white campuses, if we're talking about students of color, or more affluent campuses, if we're talking about low-income students. And we know from the research that having a sense of belonging to the university community is a key factor in student retention for all types of students. So regardless of whether you're marginalized or not, feeling like you belong to the university is a key factor. But especially for students of color, belongingness is predictive of achievement. So the extent to which students feel like they belong in the university community, that predicts their achievement at that university. It is often more difficult for marginalized students from all sorts of groups to feel like they belong on their campuses, right? And that's sort of inherent in the kind of student we're talking about, right? They're often in the minority, so it becomes more difficult for them to seek out students who look like them. It becomes way more difficult for them to seek out faculty who look like them and can mentor them. And so we have this outcome gap. Students of marginalized, or students who are marginalized, don't perform as well once they get to college. One possible cause of that outcome gap or contributor is that they don't feel like they belong, and we know that they have a hard time finding ways to feel like they belong, right? So we have sort of this puzzle to solve. Now, the what can be done about this is obviously a really big problem that I don't intend to solve today, but one possible way to increase student sense of belongingness and make them feel like they belong not only on campus, but in higher education more broadly, is to diversify the educational materials that are used in the classroom and to help students see themselves reflected in their classes. In many academic fields, this is true of behavior analysis, it's true of cognitive psychology, most of psychology, upper class white men dominate in textbooks. And I mean that in terms of who's shown and talked about in textbooks, so whose work we discuss in the textbooks and who we show, but also in terms of who writes and reviews those textbooks, right? In a lot of fields, the people who are writing textbooks are the people who've been around for a while, which in a lot of fields tend to be upper class white men, right? And so in a lot of ways, that's who's controlling the discourse in academic textbooks. Diverse individuals tend not to be depicted as scientists, right? So these are research studies evaluating the content of textbooks. So we see that the people who are featured even in stock photos of scientists tend to be white, abled people. LGBTQ issues are underrepresented in history textbooks and othered in human sexuality texts. So for instance, in a human sexuality text, you'll often see sort of the standard chapters and then one at the end of, here are all those things applied to LGBTQ issues, right? So presented as sort of a weird phenomenon. And then I can't, the screen be in the way. And then light-skinned individuals are overrepresented in medical textbooks. There was a really interesting story recently where I believe it was a Black medical student created a whole new dermatology textbook that featured images of skin disorders on people of color, because all of their textbooks showed what they look like on white people, but that doesn't tell you what it looks like on people who are darker skinned. So these kinds of things persist in a lot of different fields. This idea of white, upper middle class, typically men predominating. So here's one recent study that came out looking at the work that's talked about in biology textbooks. That citation is down there at the bottom. What you see, let me pull up my fancy annotator tool. So here you have 1900 to 1999. You see the scientists that are talked about in college biology textbooks. 88% of them are white men, 9% are women, and in this case, these are white women, 3% are people of color. You can see that there are strides being made in the textbooks published more recently. So 2000 to 2018, 67% are still white men, 25% are women, 8% are people of color. One of the things that I found striking in this publication is that they weren't even able to count Black women, because there were no Black women mentioned in any college biology textbook that they surveyed, right? Which is pretty astounding. You know that there are Black women's work that should be highlighted here. So certainly not a psychology or behavior analysis or social sciences or whatever specific problem, but it is a problem. So what can we do about this? This phenomenon also impacts students' career opportunities. There's a paradigm called Draw a Scientist, which you may have heard of, which asks typically children, or at least it started with children, but is expanded to older age groups. They ask people to just draw a scientist. And across nearly all demographics, so gender, age, racial, ethnic groups, the majority of people draw a white man when they're asked to do that, right? And there's the old saying that you can't be what you can't see. That actually tends to be true. Research shows that that's true. And so if people don't envision themselves as a scientist, they're less likely to want to become a scientist when they quote unquote grow up. We also see that the kinds of images that are in textbooks actually affect how people perform on tests of that material. So a really interesting study, at least I think is really interesting, looked at or gave middle school girls two different or one of two types of chemistry textbooks. One of them was sort of the default chemistry textbook that showed a lot of men doing science. The other one they modified to include more images of women. And the girls who were given the textbook with women scientists in it performed better on a test of that material. So at this point, we're not only talking about how they feel about the career path or how they feel about their class, we're actually talking about their ability to perform in that class, right? So a pretty important problem to solve. So then we get into what can open actually offer, right? So what is the angle that OER or open education more broadly allows us that could possibly solve this problem? So this quote unquote whitewashing of materials, though it's not just race and ethnicity, right? But this can lead to a lack of student belongingness for marginalized students and a narrowing of their career prospects, right? That's sort of to sum up what I just talked about. However, despite the importance of diverse textbooks, it can be really difficult to modify textbooks, right? It's not like we're able to, for most textbooks, just go in and erase things or copy and paste whatever we want. Most traditional textbooks, and admittedly some open ones, go through a pretty closed revision process. So people have to be invited to the process. Again, we get to this issue where the people who are invited tend to be pretty well established in their fields, which are reflective of a pretty small segment of society. So we end up with, we have these textbooks that we would like to fix in some ways, but we don't actually have access to those textbooks in a way that would allow us to do that. The restrictive copyright licenses on commercial texts don't even allow for individual teachers to make modifications to the material. So again, you can't just like edit the textbook unless you're like going in and literally with scissors and some glue making modifications. You certainly can always, you know, add things to the readings your students are doing or sort of make caveat claims when you're talking about the material, but that's in a sense a way of othering the content as well, saying that, oh, I needed to add this in is certainly not as good as just having it in the text from the beginning. So in this regard, OER can offer a path to modification for instructors or staff or whoever who are interested in effectively and accurately representing the diversity in their fields. As we know, OER are openly licensed, which allows us to make modifications even if the text itself isn't initially wonderful. So any instructor using OER can modify that textbook or those learning resources or whatever materials we're talking about to fit their local context by adding examples, pictures, questions, content, whatever, that best reflect their students. It's important to remember that we're all teaching in very different contexts. So as Veronica noted in the beginning, I'm at a Hispanic serving and a Native American serving non-tribal institution. That might look, you know, my students look a lot different and have different experiences than someone who's teaching at a predominantly white institution or someone who's teaching at an HBCU or a community college, right? And so the beauty of OER is that it recognizes that texts and learning materials aren't necessarily one size fits all, right? We all have the opportunity to modify to fit our particular students. Due to their free availability, OER are often assumed to be a tool for social justice or just generally better on these kinds of issues because we tend to, those of us who work in OER, do tend to market it as a, look at this thing you can do to equalize access to education, right? And while that's true, obviously, on the cost front, there's actually no evidence that OER are any better than commercial texts at addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you were to just pull an OpenStax book or some other book off the shelf, metaphorical shelf, there's no evidence that they're actually any better than any other textbook at showing the diversity of our fields. The creation of OER can and often does continue to reinforce the kind of inequalities that exist in the wider educational world, right? If you think about the kinds of people, or I should say maybe the kinds of institutions where people have the free time or the availability to have a course buyout to write an open textbook, right? That might be people who are at really well-resourced institutions who don't necessarily reflect the students who are at under-resourced institutions, right? So while open certainly has some a little bit of glitz and glamour and sort of the shine of educational justice, the ways in which we currently create OER often end up with the same outcomes as any other commercial textbook. But there is this power in the ability for individual people to modify that OER content, right? So even if, again, our off-the-shelf textbooks in OER world aren't doing what we need them to do, that's not the end of the story for OER, which is really the power that we're looking at. So I'm going to sum this up by making the claim that using OER to expand textbook writing and editing opportunities serves to isolate knowledge from power and allow educators and students to take more control of textbook production. And what I mean by this is that if you think about a traditional commercial textbook publisher, and I'll use the example of teaching sex ed or health textbooks in high schools in the state of Texas. There is massive pressure to create textbooks that are pleasing to legislators in the state of Texas, right? Because they are the #1 textbook buying market, I believe #1 second to California. And so what that means is that because of the politics of Texas, what that means is that they're not going to talk about queer issues in their health textbooks. And in their history textbooks, they sort of skim over the topics of slavery, right? And so what OER does is allows us to isolate knowledge, right? What we know we should be teaching our students from the power that's currently held by textbook publishers. We're no longer having to conflate those two, and it allows those of us who are in higher education and our students to have more control over textbook production. So that's sort of the pitch I'm making. Now, transitioning a little bit into what I actually did, and the part that I think perhaps could be sort of taken by some of you or all of you into your classrooms. So this actually started as just a student project. I'm very interested in projects in my classroom that don't just end up being thrown into the metaphorical file cabinet or really my email inbox at the end of the day. So something that is beneficial to students, to me, to whoever, beyond the semester in which the work is done. So I had my students in an intro psychology class. This was at WSU, a large institution, so there was approximately 110 students. They completed a semester-long project. So the first was just an interest form and a plagiarism test. They then completed an annotated bibliography because there were certain requirements for this class that I had to meet, so there was an annotated bibliography. They then completed step 3, which was a draft of their textbook edition. They used hypothesis layer #1, and if that doesn't mean anything to you right now, that's fine. I will make it mean something to you in a second. There was then a peer and TA review step, and then their final step was a final version of additions that they wanted to make to the textbook. So that was what the project was, is they are suggesting edits that could be made, edits or additions that could be made to their OER textbook. So for those of you who haven't used Hypothesis, it ends up looking something like this. So we were using the OpenStax Intro Psychology textbook. Again, I'll bring up my annotation tool. So all that this does is it creates a little layer over on the right side of the screen. This is the little Hypothesis logo. Students just sign up for a Hypothesis account. What this says public, but for the purposes of the class, these layers were private, which means that no one else could, it's not like someone in the public could randomly stumble upon their student work. So these were protected. What this looks like when students are actually using it. So this is a passage of the textbook in the section on stress. All they do is highlight this. So just like click and drag it. And then a box pops up that allows them to type in some sort of comment. So that's the actual process we used to logistically handle the annotation. So I created this OpenStax textbook, or I didn't create the textbook, I copied the textbook into a format that worked, and then students just had access to it like they did any other electronic textbook. They highlighted and made comments where they wanted to suggest edit. So for instance, here a student said, it would be beneficial to add more about the impact of racism and generational trauma. This could even constitute another potential section to the chapter. The chapter could mention epigenetics and how previous generations' trauma can impact gene expression, present day, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a student suggesting an edit to the textbook that would be more representative of the true state of, for instance, how racism affects stress levels. Another example here, so this would be a good place to note that the percent of racial and ethnic minority individuals receiving good quality treatment is even lower. And then they included a citation as to where that information could actually be found. So this is what logistically they ended up looking like. So like I said, the step 3 for them was creating draft annotations. The TAs and their peers then went in and modified those or provided feedback. And then by the end of the semester, they were creating or they were integrating these text additions into the actual textbook. That's just a zoomed in version of what I just read. So I'm going to take my spotlight off. So I then received a small grant. So it was just a local university grant of a couple of $1,000s to pay undergraduate project facilitators to sort through the comments and recommend the best of them for inclusion. So by the end of the semester, there was something like 1,000 annotations, which I had a team of TAs to grade for the course or for the purposes of the class, but for the purposes of sifting through all 1,000 of those to decide which should go into the text, it was really great to have another set of eyes on those. We used a local version of this text for our campus, basically meaning we copy and pasted the OpenStax version into our own URL. So modifications could be specific to our students. So in addition to some things surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion, we also included things like specific links to our campus health and wellness services and our mental health crisis number and those kinds of things that students are reading about in an intro psych textbook and may end up needing information about. So that's another benefit of OER, like I noted earlier, is you're able to really make that customizable for your own location and your own students. But wait, there's more. So in addition to the student project, which I think is one of the, I really like using student work here, but separately, it also just happened to, some of the timing worked out, that I also facilitated a project with OpenStax to diversify the main text that is used nationwide. So not the text that was just used at WSU, but the text that's used by people teaching intro psychology everywhere. They just happened to hear about the project I was doing with students while they were using, or they were revising their OpenStax text. And so that worked out. Maybe click. So I put out a call to both teaching specific psychology groups, so the Society for the Teaching of Psychology as an example, and diversity, equity, and inclusion focused special interest groups. So for instance, the APA divisions that are focused on gender and sexuality and race and that kind of stuff. And I really just did a bunch of cold emailing, which, you know, isn't anyone's favorite thing, but sent out a call to a bunch of people asking if they would be interested in doing just really a brief revision process and adding anything in their area of expertise that would enhance the textbook. We collected 59 annotations on 22 different sections of the book. This was a little bit of a shortened process. We didn't have as long as I would have liked, so 59 isn't a lot, but it was sufficient. These annotations were then reviewed in the recent OpenStax revision process, and some of those are now being used in that main textbook. So they're now being used by, again, not just people who are using it at WSU, but by anyone who uses the textbook anywhere. Annotations tended to be focused on areas of the text that typically have more research on topics of diversity. So for instance, social psychology, you have a decent number of researchers who research things like discrimination. Sexual behavior was the other section where we tended to get a decent number of comments, probably because the original OpenStax unit on sexual behavior is not very good. So annotations tended to focus on particular areas just because that, I think they're researchers who are interested in those topics sort of congregate in particular areas, but there were annotations across all areas of the book. And so I think that's really important to not unnecessarily focus where you're trying to diversify a text, because it's one thing to, you know, in the social psychology and the sexual behavior areas, talk really well about stereotyping and discrimination and queer issues, but then the rest of the textbook is still really whitewashed, right? We don't talk about the people of color doing research and behavior analysis. So I think it's important to make sure that those kinds of efforts are happening across all different areas of the textbooks. Okay, so that's how we collected options, I suppose, annotation suggestions across the text. I then decided, because I am an experimental psychologist, that this wasn't particularly useful unless I was able to study it. So I took 422 students from, or participants from the Washington State University Human Subjects Pool. They were given a set of readings on social psychology and sexual behavior, again, focused there because that's where the majority of annotations came in. The sample was predominantly women, white, and continuing generation, so just the opposite of first generation. Continuing generation students are those whose parents have college degrees. This reflects the WSU population, so nothing particularly strange there. They were randomly assigned to either the standard condition, where the reading was directly from the OpenStax psychology book as it previously existed, or the modified condition, where the book was supplemented by contributors. And those contributors in this case were a collection of both my students and the people who contributed to the OpenStax process. Participants then completed a set of questionnaires after reading one of those sets of textbook readings. They assessed the readings, so the quality of the readings. They were asked questions about a hypothetical instructor who might use these readings in their class. They were asked about their sense of belonging on campus, and they were asked some demographic questions. So we found that there were no differences between the text on ratings of the readings or assessments of a hypothetical instructor using these texts. This was important because one of the, I'd say not particularly strong arguments, but one of the arguments is, well, if we add things about diversity, that's really taking away from the core content and the important things in the text, and students will get distracted. It appears in this case that wasn't true, so students rated the text the same. They also didn't have any differing opinions on a hypothetical instructor who was using these texts. We do see, this is not related to the textbooks at all, but unsurprisingly on WSU's campus, which is a primarily white institution, for all statements, underrepresented minority students, in this case based on race and ethnicity, reported a lower sense of belonging because of their racial group compared to white participants. So on the, where's my annotation? So on the y-axis, you just have a mean score. Higher scores mean higher sense of belonging. You have white students in pink and underrepresented minority students in navy. And you see a variety of statements on the x-axis. So being taken seriously by professors, underrepresented minority students report that happening less frequently, contributing to discussions in class, finding like-minded friends, right? So overall, students at this primarily white institution were feeling less belonging, right? Which is what the research would tell us would be happening, right? And like I introduced earlier, that lower sense of belonging is important for a lot of outcomes, right? Whether or not students graduate is one option, okay? What we also found related to the textbook is that first generation students in the standard condition, so when they were reading the regular textbook that they would have read in any intro psychology class, they self-reported feeling less comfortably socially on the campus due to their financial circumstances, right? These are first-gen students who are typically of lower income status. But this difference did not exist when they read the modified text. So when they were reading the text that was more diverse and more inclusive, we see over here that that gap no longer exists. So after reading the modified textbook, the more inclusive textbook, we don't see that first generation students have a lowered sense of belonging, which I think is really interesting, especially because these annotations weren't intentionally directed towards income status. Most of them were talking about diversity as it relates to race and ethnicity and sex and gender. And so it's interesting that a more inclusive book, even if it's not necessarily targeted to a particular demographic, tends to be helpful for marginalized students. So I think that's something to reflect on. Okay, so I presented a problem. I suggested why open can be a way to achieve this or to fix this problem. Talked about what I did, talked about what I found. Now, how can you actually use this info to change your field? So real quick, sum up. So the four, I think, key takeaways, or that I'd prefer you take away here, is that one, textbooks overwhelmingly feature white, upper class, old dudes, both textually and graphically, and this has negative consequences for marginalized students. Two, OER gives us options to change this phenomenon. Three, there are many ways to use the resources we have to make these changes. You can let your students help and make it a project. And in fact, a project that's much more fun to grade than a regular essay. Tap in your colleagues, be creative, right? It's not just that you have to write an entire textbook on your own, which I think sometimes we believe. And then four, when we make these changes, we can make a tangible difference for our marginalized students, right? I just showed you that even a brief 15-minute reading that was more inclusive made first-generation students feel more belonging on campus, right? Imagine what would happen if that was over the course of the semester. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to.
Oh, and it looks like you might have muted yourself. So if I heard you right, you're gonna turn it back over to me.
Yes.
And okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm going to request remote control of your computer so we don't have to do any awkward screen swapping. And then, so how does this relate to behavior analysis? What are some ways in which we can adapt and adopt the procedures that Dr. Nusbaum has shared with us today? Well, we shared one with you already with our members in our August event. Cynthia Nava and Dr. Terafemi came to present on, this really wonderful project that was published in 2019 in the Behavior Analysis and Practice Journal about how to involve student content creators. Now, at the time that they presented to us, and the version of the article that was presented didn't have anything to do with open educational resources. It simply included students as content creators. But I'm so pleased and so proud to report that since that presentation, Dr. Fahmy has updated the assignment and the way that she delivers it with specific attention to open licensing in supporting students to potentially share these wonderful artifacts that they're creating, short videos demonstrating basic conceptual principles like reinforcement or extinction burst or stimulus control, getting students interested and familiar with open licensing so that not only are they creating those materials, but potentially sharing them with colleagues that they've never even met before. And of course, if you are a member of the Open Educational Resources Special Interest Group, you know already that these materials are posted in our member forum. But if you're not yet a member, you can join us. We are one of the only special interest group in all of the Association for Behavior Analysis International that is free to join. And you don't even have to be a behavior analyst. We would love to host you. So check out our member forum for more information about that session. We also would love to highlight for you 3 contemporary projects that we are working on. There we go. So there's a little bit of a delay there, so I apologize if we're going to get some moving forward too quickly. But 3 projects that Dr. Potter and Dr. Pavone and I presented on at the recent Cultural Behavior Conference for Behavior Analysts, 3 projects that members of our SIG are doing now. First, Dr. Maggie Pavone has been working with students who are accruing indirect hours as a result of COVID to evaluate what materials currently exist that could correspond with the 5th edition BACB task list. So, if you're becoming certified as a clinical behavior analyst, you have to complete coursework, you have to learn certain things on the 5th edition task list, but adopting open is hard because we don't have a lot of open materials, except that we kind of do. They're hidden, they're secret, they're squirreled away, and the metadata is really terrible. So Dr. Pavone worked with some graduate students to suss out these resources, to correctly identify what principles and procedures were being exemplified in these materials. If you want to know more about this project, of course, check out our member forum where we have actually posted the entire poster for the project, and you can learn a little bit more about that. We actually have with us today Dr. Rachel Potter, who, would you mind describing the task list glossary project?
I will. I'm wondering where the "Hey, would you chat today" memo was, but I'm happy to do that. So the task list glossary project came about. I teach and coordinate our ABA program at the university where I am, and a lot of students were asking, well, we need more examples. We want examples of all these different terms that are in the task list, and they have examples from their text, and they have examples that I give them, and of course I want them to generate their own unique and novel examples that highlight their own experiences. But in particular, what I was noticing is that students were requesting examples in specific domains. Can you give us more nutrition fitness examples? Can you give us pop culture funny examples about Bart Simpson? So they really wanted tangible examples that were across a variety of domains. And so what we've launched this year in partnership with Veronica and her students and Dr. Pavone and hers is getting students to be part of creating these examples for this glossary, which I hope once it's ready will be searchable in a way that a student or a practitioner could, in an interactive way, click on a term and see that term with a variety of examples across different domains. Or if it's a student who's interested maybe in just OBM or just animal behavior, can search by the domain that they're interested in and then come across a list of these examples of the term. So we're just at the very beginning stages. I think I have, for my institution right now, about 50 entries. And so hopefully over the course of this academic year that will grow, and then we'll figure out the software part of it and how to actually make it accessible.
And I love that entire description, because not only is it accurate, but it kind of highlights the spirit of a lot of the open work that I think Dr. Nussbaum has described and we're doing now, which is sometimes there's just an opportunity. Sometimes it's just like, what if we were to just, and you give it a try, even if the systems surrounding and supporting it are not the best, because it could be a really great opportunity. Hence, no memo today, Dr. Potter. And then finally, the last project that I want to share with you is the Open Behavior Artifacts project. This is a project that I've been working on with students in a senior level undergraduate course in behavior analysis, inviting students to explain a concept in any format, in any medium, with any license, but in a way that is both technologically precise but also user-friendly, because it's a critical skill for any kind of practitioner or consultant, is being able to talk the talk, but talk the talk in a way that's going to be approachable to the audience. So more information about all of these projects are available, but I think turning it back over to Dr. Nussbaum.
Yeah, and I want to just quickly, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Want to pause share. I want to exit that, and I just want to show you what hypothesis actually looks like. Can you also see this sharing?
Yeah, we see the slides.
Oh, no, that's not what I want you to see. Now can you see an article?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is, I think one of the concerns that Veronica raised to me is that because there aren't a lot of open things in OER, can we still use something like hypothesis behind a paywall? I'm going to be honest, I haven't done that in my classes, but I think the answer is yes. So here's the small difference. So what I showed you in those screenshots of my project was hypothesis embedded in the web page itself. So because I was able to take a textbook and put it in basically the platform I wanted it, I could also embed hypothesis myself. But hypothesis is nifty and has a browser extension. And so if you were just to have your students download the hypothesis browser extension, they would then sign up, log in. You'll note this looks the exact same as it did in the screenshots. And then I could go in, do that. All I do is click annotate, and it looks the exact same other than the fact that I need to be logged in. What you would probably do is create, once you're signed in, you'd create a private layer. All then students need is the particular URL that Hypothesis gives you. And much like what I showed you where students have private layers so that the public can't just randomly see their work, you can do that with this version of Hypothesis as well. So I don't think textbooks being behind a paywall is problematic. You'll note that this article is in my library access to psych info. So I'm pretty sure that should still work, even if it's not an OER that you're working with from the beginning. So my end challenge to you is, how are you going to use the democratizing power of open to help marginalized students see themselves in behavior analysis? So that's what I want you to sort of be thinking about as you leave this presentation today. Thank you for coming and engaging. I'm on Twitter there, and I'm available via email there, and I would be happy to talk to anyone who wanted to talk to me about anything. And this child will not be quiet. I'm happy to take questions as well if anyone has them. I'm going to stop sharing.
So a wonderful opportunity for questions. Just want to remind folks that if you are here to earn CEs, please don't forget to sign out for us. Don't forget to rate the event, but not taking time away from the questions, please.
Veronica, I'd like to ask a question. And I asked it in the chat, but I would love it, Dr. Nussbaum, if you could speak to it too. Can you talk about students who've had to use mobile devices for annotation and how Veronica kindly posted the link, but I'd love to hear if you have any anecdotes of how that process went.
Yeah, anecdotally, so WSU doesn't have, it's a residential campus. There is a live-in rule, so there isn't as many tech issues as, for instance, there are at my current institution. I did have a few students who reported that they used their phones and it worked fine. They were able to do that. I don't know if there would be, so like I just noted with Hypothesis, I used a version of Hypothesis that was added directly to the page. I don't know if there would be access differences or ease of use differences in the version that I just showed you, which is a Chrome extension. I'm just not sure the technical quirks of using extensions mobily. So that would be something to investigate. So that's what I've got for you.
Well, and I think, if you'll forgive me, a slightly more advanced question that I'm trying to wrap my head around is the fact that we make all of these like claims, all these favorable claims about the efficacy of OER, and we try to hypothesize, like, no pun intended, for the program. We try to figure out why it is that OER seems to work, because the evidence suggests that OER is really good at improving student performance, with reducing students' drop rates or withdrawals from courses, of kind of making sure that students succeed and proceed faster through their coursework. But we don't understand, like, why. Why does that happen? It doesn't seem to be this thing called the access hypothesis. It doesn't seem to be the idea that you have your materials from day one. So I have mixed feelings about that. So what else is it about OER that could be doing? I literally don't know. But understanding what it is could be particularly helpful for us in behavior analysis, because we know that we have a field that is not only incredibly dogmatic, not only incredibly rigid, right? And there's that really high access threshold. You have to get through a lot. You have to deal, like, in the case of my students, bless them, they're very patient with me, but they have to put up with a lot of me saying, like, is that the term that you think you mean? Like, is that the way you want to say that word? There's a huge kind of learning curve to even get into behavior analysis. So what could OER do for behavior analysis in a way that could make behavior analysis for everybody, that could really deliver on Skinner's dream of saving the world?
No, I'll solve that real quick in 5 minutes. No, I mean, like, I think that's the big question open, right? Is like, we know it works, but why? I think some of it might be the things that open text, like the use of an open textbook allows us to do certain things. So for instance, while I know that Hypothesis works behind paywalls, I'm not sure that I would have engaged in this kind of project if I didn't know that at the end of the day I could actually make these changes, right? It's one thing to do this project for just the benefit of student learning, and then it's behind a paywall, the textbook, and those things actually don't get integrated into the book, right? That's a fine student project. I'm just not sure if I would have had the mental capacity and resources to do it if it was just for that purpose, right? And so I think there are things that open maybe allows us, open some opportunities for us to use some interesting and novel pedagogy that maybe we wouldn't otherwise be able to do with commercial textbook pedagogy, that I would like to say is better than just a class with 4 exams or something similar. So that's sort of my hunch a little bit about what that might be. I think, you know, this sort of treads into an area that gets a little prickly, but Veronica, as you know, I'm fine being a little bit prickly. I think the kinds of instructors who are willing to engage with open and make those kinds of changes might already be doing some interesting things in their classrooms. And there's evidence that even with it, when it's the same instructor, like if you have instructor A using commercial and then they switch to open, people still improve, right? So it's not that it's just an instructor effect. But I think that certainly could be part of it, an instructor effect that there's, there are people perhaps in behavior analysis who tend to be a little bit more rigid in the way they teach things and don't want to adjust those things. And maybe that's, yeah, I know, you don't think of anyone off the top of your head right now. And so I think it's very complicated. I think there are messages we send to students when we give them free options, because I don't know about you all when you teach classes with open, if you've been able to, but that is usually accompanied in my classes by some sort of spiel by me about how textbook publishers are a racket and how I don't want them to spend their money on that. And right, that sets a little bit of a tone for what I think about them as people. And so I think that it's a complicated question. I think the thing that can be changed is that pedagogy thing. So how does using open allow me to do different things in the classroom that I otherwise wouldn't be able to do? I think that's the thing we can really think about and possibly make changes based on in this moment.
Well, and it's interesting, you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that idea of looking at the perception of instructors who are using open. And let me see if I can go back to find the specific comment that you made. Nope, it's gone. It's gone. It's gone forever. But that idea that using open changes the audience's perception of the user or the creator or the instructor.
So I've actually done research that shows that that's true, that in classes where open is being used, ratings of instructors are higher. So we took our intro psych, which had 11 sections, all with graduate student instructors. Most of them were new. And we found that at the end of the semester, those who were using open were rated better. And that sort of takes away the, well, it's just the kind of people who want to use open, because we randomly assigned those sections. But so they didn't get a choice in whether or not they used open. And so there is definitely something that happens there in that relationship between faculty and students, or in how you're able to teach. I don't know what it is, but something happens. Ma'am, I'm in a meeting.
And I think that that's incredibly powerful, especially for a field, for instance, where there's the perception that everybody kind of hates you, or you're maybe a little bit less accepted than colleagues who, for instance, just for instance, might teach social psych.
Oh,
right? Because who doesn't love a social psych?
We might hate each other, but we also both hate social psychologists.
Oh, social psychologists.
It's a little bit like how people driving cars hate pedestrians and pedestrians hate people driving cars, but everyone hates people on bikes.
Everybody hates bicyclists. Oh, well, I want to be sensitive of your time, and I recognize that your co-author is Fussy Bear who might be hungry. Any last minute questions for Dr. Nusbaum? And of course, if you haven't already, please take a moment to give us some feedback so we can share your very kind comments with Dr. Nusbaum indirectly if you prefer not to give them. Any last minute questions or comments for our speaker?
And I would be happy to, if anyone is interested in a project like this or just wants to look at like the rubrics, I have all of the rubrics. I also have a paper published based on this. So if anyone wants to have that information, you can either email, if you didn't get my email down, Veronica can shoot me any emails that you have, or she also has access to those things. So.
And I think we would love to.
She has not been a better little presenter today.
You know, this is her first presentation, right? You got to cut her some slack.
Yeah, but she's had 7 weeks of classes.
Classes are different. It's different.
My students are doing the work in the classes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. Of course, if you have any questions, please let us know. We will do our best to post ancillary resources in our member forum. So I'll follow up with you, Dr. Nusbaum, to get some material to share with others. But thank you so much for your time this morning. It's amazing.
I'm going to take off my fancy shirt, which has cats on it. I don't know if you noted that. There are cats on it, even though I'm a dog person. So that was my example of my cognitive self opening myself up to your behavior people. And my dog is now about to tear down my laptop. So
All right. Thanks, everybody.
bye.